Okay, new policy. Don't go hiding in a nobleman's bathroom when chased by the Arbites, or try to escape through the piping. They really don't clean them as well as they claim. Hello! Welcome back to the Wolf's Corner. Sorry for such a delay. The Arbites have been on my tail for some time. Guess they really didn't like me borrowing one of their rhinos to get away from that Inquisitor. Or maybe they were mad about me crashing into that hive tower. Nah! Anyway, now that I have a moment to get this Vox out to you, let's get back to the Badab War. As soon as I get this dirt off the data slate. There we are. Now, last we left off, the Imperials had discovered the horrifying truth about the Astral Claws, even while the Imperium seemed to be on the verge of truly turning the tide of the war. Sadly, these hopes would be quickly dashed, as even more forces and factions would join in on this conflict. A disastrous defeat for the Loyalist forces in early 907 would mark the bloodiest year of the conflict, as the bulk of the Executioner's chapter had arrived in force in the Maelstrom zone, and immediately conducted a surprise attack at Chimera. The Executioners were not going to waste time after rushing to join this war, after all. With the speed of their attack, they succeeded in destroying the Loyalist outposts, listening stations, and, worst of all, the vital astropathic relay complex on the night moons of the Chimera system in one stroke. The Howling Griffin's chapter forces garrisoning the Chimera system were outnumbered and overwhelmed, suffering greatly as their bastions and stations fell one after the other despite their tenacious defense. The Howling Griffins were systematically destroyed by the relentless onslaught of the Executioners from this unseen quarter. Yes, even the Emperor's Angels can be caught off guard. As the Howling Griffin's positions were being overrun and decimated on the airless Dust Moon and in other parts of the system, it fell to Dreadnought Confessor Titus to rally the beleaguered forces of his chapter. Unafraid of the firestorm around him, the great warrior led his battle brothers with implacable zeal in a desperate counterattack, which bought his chapter the chance to regroup and mount an effective fighting defense at the cost of his long life. This was a terrible blow to the Howling Griffins, as not only did they lose a mighty dreadnought, but the experience and skill of the warrior within was gone too. These facts crushed the Howling Griffins' morale even while they continued to fight on. Fortunately, the Griffins were not fighting full Chaos Space Marines. After the Executioners had finally withdrawn from the battlefield, the surviving Howling Griffins found that their foe had honored Titus's glorious sacrifice by laying out the wreck of his sarcophagus within a ring of broken weapons, placing one of their own shattered standards in the lifeless grasp of the fallen war machine. If it had been full traitors, they would very likely mutilated the sarcophagus. Such is their way. With the Chimera system's defense platforms and listening stations destroyed, the Executioner's forces had achieved their primary objective. They could have pressed their advantage and utterly destroyed the Howling Griffin's outpost, but instead they withdrew suddenly from the system, leaving the Howling Griffin's garrison with more than 70% casualties. This development provoked a great deal of anxiety from Huron, but he was mindful of the dangerous temperament of the Executioner's commander, the High Chaplain Thulsa Kane. So Huron did not issue any formal reprimand to them, even though I'm certain he would have wanted to do so, and instead welcomed them into the battle for the secessionist cause. Despite the grievous losses dealt to them by these new arrivals to the Badab sector, the remainder of the Howling Griffin's task force continued to doggedly fight on, refusing to shrink away from their responsibilities to the Loyalist cause, until formally relieved from the war in 909. However, the new arrivals were not the only problem facing the Loyalists at this time. Taking advantage of the anarchy that reigned within the Maelstrom zone, it was unsurprising that attacks from unaligned raiding forces and xenos races based within the turbulent expanse of the Maelstrom dramatically increased, reaching a new height during this same year. The secessionists suffered the worst at the hands of these non-aligned forces during the Badab War, which makes sense as they had the most to lose from the forces within the Maelstrom pushing out of it, in this humble servant's opinion. A large Orc Corsair fleet spilled forth from the Kala system, assaulting secessionist supply convoys between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector, and ultimately assaulted the Mantis warriors at Endymion itself. a large force of over 20,000 orcs proceeded to slaughter the planet's meager garrison, forcing the Mantis warriors to pull back to defend Endymion and meet the orcs in a rapid-moving land battle on the dust plains of Orilla, lest they lose that world. As serious as the orc attacks against the cluster was, there was far worse implications of the growing threat of the demon-tainted Corsair cults based on the blighted world of Magog. Their power was what had actually driven forth the recently defeated orcs. This forced the secessionists to launch a direct assault on the hellish world, which, despite a prior Exterminatus campaign, had long remained a thorn in the Maelstrom Order's side. This, I imagine, was one of the many issues that Huron had brought up as examples for why the Maelstrom Orders needed reinforcements to effectively suppress the zone. To defeat this threat, Corian Sumatras, one of Huron's most seasoned battle captains, commanded an Astral Claws battle barge and conducted the attack on Magog. A force of 2 companies of the chapter and a strong force of hand-picked Astral Claws and Lamenters Terminators successfully cut off the threat while it was still forming. The tyrant knew well they could ill afford the risk of fighting a war on 2 fronts if they continued to allow the dire threat on Magog to continue to grow. Though it was a costly diversion that caused a high number of fatalities, the secessionists were able to reinforce their flank just as a new enemy entered the conflict. And what an enemy it was! The powerful, fleet-based chapter of Dark Renown, the Minotaurs, arrived in full strength in the Maelstrom Zone in mid-907. They announced their presence in the war by launching a full chapter-scale assault on the secessionist-controlled mining facilities on Cairo, wiping out the 46,000-strong Tyrant Legion garrison and rendering the mine works unusable. Afterwards, the Minotaurs sent a ship with a representative and officially presented themselves to the Loyalist Council of War. Their master, the darkly famed Asterion Moloch, remained with his chapter to raid through the Pale Stars region in order to decimate rather than conquer a pre-planned list of resource-producing worlds within the region in order to starve the secessionist war effort. While the Minotaurs chapter succeeded overall strategic authority to the War Council of the Loyalist chapters already engaged in the conflict, they deliberately stayed largely aloof and distant from its general chain of command, distancing themselves from the other chapters as was their wont, and deferring to the Legate Inquisitor's authority more often than that of the Lord High Commander Carab Cullen or his advisors. This distance was shown in their standing representative to the War Council, the gaunt, brooding, and taciturn chaplain Ivanas Enkomi, whose red-rimmed eyes observed all, although he barely spoke a word during the gatherings. The Minotaur's chapter master Moloch never put in a personal appearance at these councils, and the only evidence that he served during the Badab conflict at all came from picked footage recovered from battle scans and fearful stories spread by the few secessionist survivors of the Minotaur's brutal attacks. The Minotaur's involvement, I have no doubt, definitely helped swing the tide of the war, but I also imagine it caused some issue with other chapters given their reputation. And honestly, who can blame their worry when the Minotaurs introduced themselves by wiping out an entire bloody planet? Now, of course, it is an effective strategy, but by the God Emperor, what an entrance that was. Now, some of you, my dear loyal listeners, must be wondering, why did the Minotaurs show up in the first place? Well, the answer is rather simple. The Minotaurs had come in answer to the direct summons from the acting Legate Inquisitor for more Space Marines to join the Loyalist cause against the secessionist chapters. Though the arrival of this savage chapter was cautiously welcomed by the Loyalists, they undoubtedly couldn't deny the considerable strength that would be added to the Imperium's cause. The conflict was in its 4th year of open warfare, and the Minotaurs committed their entire chapter to the war, 10 companies and 11 capital ships of various sizes. The Minotaurs attacked indiscriminately, attacking not only the 30-plus secessionist-controlled minor worlds and stations, but also overlooked independent minor outposts. Operating largely independently in the southern Maelstrom zone, the Minotaurs proceeded to strike targets amid the Pale Stars and Dene Stellar Drift border regions. The viciousness of the chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors among those that resisted them quickly grew and remained uncontested until the arrival of an even more savage and brutal chapter to the conflict. Against this unending tide of violence, only the warships and strike forces of the executioners seemed able to halt the Minotaurs' progress within the region, the two chapters appearing to relish battle between them as a kind of bloody sport. For the remainder of the year, the Minotaurs gained several important victories for the Loyalist cause, destroying the Tyrant's Legion forces on Crow's Word and Larsa, and forced the Astral Claws to withdraw or risk having their worlds isolated and ravaged one by one. Within 1/3 of a standard year of the Minotaurs' arrival in the region, the direct and collateral damage caused by their forces reduced the human population of the Pale Stars alone by more than 20%. The power of this chapter quickly proved a decisive weight in the Loyalist favor, regardless of its brutal methods. By the end of 907, the secessionist forces had begun to be pushed back from several key systems and suffered severe losses. In the northern-central Maelstrom zone, the battle for Galen between the Astral Claws and a joint force of salamanders and fire angels eventually resulted in the Loyalists successfully taking the system. To further add to the secessionists' dreadful luck in this part of the war, they lost the world of Viana, which finally fell after a massive joint assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions chapters. Basically, the Inquisition's whipping boys. Huron had all but abandoned the world and the sizable Tyrant's Legion garrison stationed there to their fate. As the Angels of Death fell amongst the beleaguered defenders, their end was swift and brutal. By dawn, Viana was in Loyalist hands as the Tyrant's Legion was put to the sword. In early 908, Inquisitorial agents had acquired evidence of a plot between the Astral Claws and renegade heretic scavengers from the Golgothan Wastes. They had devised a plan to acquire recovered buried weapons stored on the dead world of Synax. The Sons of Medusa task force, backed by the newly arrived company from the Exorcist chapter, were given the task to stop this. Sons of Medusa led the determined and brutal campaign to scour out the Tyrant's forces, the conduct of which caused some discord between the two chapters, with accusations that the Sons of Medusa were more interested in pursuing their own mysterious agenda instead of hunting down the enemy as quickly as possible. The Exorcists soon withdrew and redeployed their forces for the forthcoming assault on the Sagan system, leaving the Sons of Medusa to eliminate the Synax threat as they saw fit. The Second Battle of Sagan was a major planetary assault undertaken in 908 that drove the secessionists from their fortresses in the Sagan subsector. The assault was carried out by the largest combined Loyalist force fielded to that point during the Badab War. This offensive utilized the mass strength of the Fire Angels, Red Scorpions, and Exorcist chapters, supported by assault specialized forces drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Nova Marines. The secessionists chose to mount a defense at any cost, rather than giving up the vital Sagan system. They were traitors, but they were still tactically minded Astartes, not slobbering, blood-crazed chaos heretics. The fighting proved to be bloody and costly in the extreme. In a desperate attempt to either drive the Loyalists from the surface of Sagan III, or render the planet unusable to them, the Astral Claws resorted to the use of virus weapons that slew tens of thousands of the world's population. This use of weapons of mass destruction ultimately destroyed a sizable component of the secessionists' own battle line. The Fire Angels deployed their full chapter strength and bore the brunt of the Loyalist casualties, valiantly sacrificing themselves in order to contain the Astral Claws' desperate final attempts to drive their forces from the world through the utilization of suicide attacks. This campaign resulted in the highest death toll of any single engagement of the war to this point, as well as the loss of several key secessionist warships in a vain counterattack on the system. The successful invasion of the Sagan system proved to be a major turning point of the war. After the system fell under Loyalist control, it became the primary Imperial base in the Maelstrom zone, affording the Loyalist offensive greater access to the primary stable warp routes into the region, while denying those same routes to the enemy. Shortly after the end of the campaign, Sagan III was used as a supply point in order to fully relieve and reinforce Sungrad and support the start of the Endymion suppression campaign. This Loyalist advance effectively forced the remaining Mantis Warrior forces into a purely defensive posture, isolating them from the Badab sector and their secessionist allies. In effect, the Maelstrom zone was now split into two regions, the Endymion cluster and the still heavily defended Badab sector itself. From this point onward in the conflict, the secessionists were only able to conduct commerce raids and targeted strikes which were carried out by the vessels of the Executioners and Lamenters chapter fleets. In other words, it was the beginning of the end for Huron and his dreams of seceding from the Imperium. However, the war was far from over, and new problems were about to begin. With the secessionists having been judged sufficiently contained after the victory at Sagan, the Loyalists redeployed the chapters that had suffered battlefield attrition to some degree to deal with a new greenskin threat. With such a relatively significant force of Astartes deployed to fight the traitors among the Maelstrom, large orc incursions in the form of multiple Waa's erupted across the eastern fringe of the galaxy in the Segmentum Ultima. This redeployment included the forces of the Nova Marines, Raptors, and Howling Griffins chapters. They were withdrawn one by one from the conflict in managed stages as part of a major Imperium-wide strategic redeployment, along with a number of warships of the Segmentum Solar Reserve forces, which had been deployed in support of the Loyalist cause. However, the secessionists were not able to take advantage of this redeployment of Imperial forces, as one of their chapters was now square in the sights of the Legate Inquisitor. Legate Inquisitor Frayne provided the Loyalists with a mass of data about the Lamenters' movements and deployments, which was used to identify a pattern. By 908, the Lamenters chapter had already suffered significant losses through attrition, but they were still a formidable force to be reckoned with, and a plan was put into action to isolate them from the Tyrant's cause and take them out of the war permanently. Using the intel acquired by Frayne's spy network, the Loyalists quickly discerned that the Lamenters were being used as a shield by the Tyrant of Badab to guard his southern flank and contest the Loyalist domination of the Pale Stars, while he kept the bulk of the Astral Claws in reserve near Badab itself. The losses incurred by the fleet-based chapter had been due to their continuous deployments defending the southern Badab sector, as well as serving escort duty to many secessionist supply convoys. The Minotaurs gathered in strength, awaiting the opportunity to strike where they would be most effective, and soon that opportunity came when the location of the Lamenters' chapter bark, Mater Lacrimarum, was discovered in orbit over the feral world of Optera, taking on supplies. From what I've learned from the inquisitorial records, a part of me feels sympathy for the Lamenters. Even though they may be of the dreaded cursed founding, they still fought on in defiance of their fate, and did what they thought was right for the Imperium and the God Emperor. They're still traitors, though, but I can't deny that if anything, they are reluctant traitors out of all of them. Now back to what happened to them. I think you can all imagine what is about to occur. The Minotaurs immediately dispatched a rapid strike force to attack the vessel and succeeded in catching it and crippling its main drives, preventing it from fleeing the system. The Lamenters were forced to defend their chapter bark at all costs, as it contained both their recovering battle casualties as well as their precious resource of gene seed. With the continued attacks on the bark, the majority of the Lamenters' fleet was drawn back to the Optera system. Once there, the Minotaurs laid bloody siege for 17 standard hours of brutal ship-to-ship fighting. Though the Minotaurs suffered heavy casualties, they eventually overpowered the Lamenters by virtue of their brutality and sheer weight of numbers. Their forces shattered, the few remaining Lamenters were forced to surrender, rather than risk the annihilation of their precious bark. The majority of their fleet was left ruined or drifting in the void. The Minotaurs claimed salvage rights to the crippled Lamenters' fleet and the war gear of the fallen to replace their own serious losses. The surviving Lamenters were incarcerated on a prison orbiting the night side of Sagan II, amid rumors of their growing insanity in confinement. Only 311 Lamenters' battle brothers survived to be interred on the prison hulk for the rest of the war. Less than 100 Lamenters were estimated to be deployed elsewhere during the fighting that still remained. The chapter's severe losses effectively removed them from the secessionist order of battle. The loss of the Lamenters from the secessionist cause was a significant blow they could not afford. It was a sixth of their fighting force, and a fairly mobile force that had been able to launch rapid strikes against the Loyalists, not something you want to lose at this point. While continuing the war, the Loyalists intervened in matters unfolding on the world of Angstrom in 908, in what would become one of the most remarkable operations of the Badab War. The sovereign, independent Adeptus Mechanicus domain of Angstrom in the eastern Maelstrom zone had remained neutral throughout the conflict, rejecting diplomatic missions and threats from both sides to join them in their cause. The Magos felt that there was no cause for them to interfere in what they perceived as an internal dispute between rival Imperial factions. Once again, the Cogheads are too busy tinkering to notice the firestorm all around them. Angstrom continued their operations as usual, which included a long-standing agreement to render up a bounty of advanced weapons and refined ores to be collected by the Imperium's representative on a 3-yearly cycle from the edge of the planetary system. The Magos pointedly didn't care from which of the Imperium's servants retrieved the bounty, only that they carried out their part of the arrangement without fault. In the past, this arrangement had provided the Maelstrom warders with a vital resource, and the Tyrant's servants continued to be in the perfect position to collect it. The Red Scorpions and Salamanders jointly conducted a secret plan of attack, deploying a small elite force to sabotage and prevent the secessionists from claiming the bounty of the independent Forge world. In the confusion and destruction that followed, the Angstrom Mechanicus, incensed by the outbreak of hostilities within their domain, assaulted both forces and drove them away from the system, granting the Loyalists a major strategic victory. But it did, however, stir the notoriously bellicose Mechanicus into taking a greater interest in the war. Just think about that for a second. A single independent Forge world managed to repel forces of the Adeptus Astartes. I shudder to imagine what things they released to do that. So these Magos were now going to join in the conflict, and they did so in a very grandiose way. They sent their warships and ground forces in retaliatory raids against Galen and Ibis until the Terran legates intervened and brokered a peace, guaranteeing the fickle Angstrom Mechanicus restitutions. Lord High Commander Cullen took precautionary measures and dispatched the Firehawks and the Raptorus Rex alongside a pursuit force, composed of a mixture of Loyalist chapters, to conduct a blockade of the Outer Systems approaches for the duration of the war. Really not sure that the Lord High Commander chose the right chapter for the job, but hey, at least he's got that massive star fortress now guarding the system. By 909, the Imperium Loyalists had effective control of the Maelstrom Zone's major warp routes, enabling them to rapidly move their forces across the region and subject many rebel worlds and outposts to attack. Only the unpredictable forces of the Executioners chapter offered a significant threat to the Loyalist control outside the secessionist enclaves. From this point onwards, the secessionists, greatly reduced in fighting strength and ships, were effectively hemmed in around a handful of heavily defended star clusters and relegated to conducting scattered raiding operations and fighting a series of close defensive sieges. By the end of 909, whispers had reached Imperial intelligence operatives of the tyrant's increasing violence and paranoia, and of the further tightening of his murderous stranglehold on those worlds he still controlled. In particular, the Mantis warriors were reduced to fighting a guerrilla resistance against an ongoing Loyalist suppression campaign against combined elements from the Fire Angels and Sons of Medusas. Sporadic and often bloody engagements were also fought in the Tranquility, Iblis, and Sigurd systems. The Loyalist forces suffered a severe defeat when the Fire Angels' strike cruiser Polaris Rising was raided by the Mantis warriors under the leadership of their prophetic Master Librarian Ahraza Redith. They succeeded in damaging the main plasma reactors and weapon bays before withdrawing their forces, leaving them at the mercy of 2 Orc kill cruisers. The Fire Angels fought a resolute last stand against the vile Greenskins, disabling one of the kill cruisers before they were boarded by the remaining Orc vessel. As the Orcs swarmed to the decks of the Fire Angels' vessel, the Mantis warriors fell in ambush upon the badly mauled Orc forces from their flank and annihilated them. The remaining 37 Fire Angels were marooned on Sigurd 6 under the care of their surviving apothecary and his med servitors, while their battered vessel was taken by the Mantis warriors as their prize. The executioners continued to prove to be the scourge of Loyalist patrols and supply convoys, as well as destroying numerous outposts and listening stations. Some 43 merchantmen and 11 warships had either been seized or destroyed. They also committed themselves to several heavy raids as far as Bellerophon's Fall and Cairo. Their heaviest actions fell against the Minotaurs in the southern Maelstrom zone, such as the bloody tank duel fought on the airless moon of Zeal in the Crow's world system. The location of the Executioner's base of operations continued to elude the Loyalists, allowing the Executioners to raid almost at will, giving battle against the Red Scorpions and the Minotaurs, harrying Loyalist shipping, and stopping attempts to consolidate Loyalist gains. The Loyalists knew that the next phase of the campaign would be particularly brutal. It would be a time of ruthless planetary purges, scorched earth campaigns, and apocalyptic sieges. The Loyalists needed time to prepare for such a campaign and fresh reinforcements if a victory was to be swiftly achieved. But Lord High Commander Cullen and his advisors knew they could not afford to wait too long before they went on the offensive, for every day gave the secessionists further opportunity to entrench and perhaps make good their own losses. Cullen knew he simply could not afford to allow a general of Huron's caliber too long to rebuild, plan, and prepare. The beginning of the year 910 proved to be a final deathly calm before the oncoming storm which would inevitably see the Badab War brought to its terrible conclusion. Many of the chapters on the Loyalist side had suffered substantial losses, and now would be replaced by other Space Marine chapters of even darker renown. The Maelstrom Zone would soon be visited by slaughter unlike anything it had known in its long and turbulent history. For 6 long years, the isolated Galen system had been a prize that had been battled over repeatedly, changing hands between Loyalist and Secessionist forces several times. Most significantly, the Galen system had been the site of a major battle between the Firehawks chapter and a mixed Secessionist assault force which had incurred heavy losses on both sides, a battle which had seen Galen II's life-supporting domes laid waste, leading to mass refugee immigration to its neighbor, the frontier world of Galen VI. Under the direct command of the Magister Militum, yes, he's had a new name, Carib Cullen, he ordered the Loyalist forces diverted to impose order on Galen VI, crushing any hope of future resistance utterly. Accompanied by an Ordo Hereticus detachment under Inquisitor Cramner, one of Legate Inquisitor Freyne's personal aides, the only stipulation was that the planet was to remain habitable with a sufficient core of the population and infrastructure left alive and intact to service the needs of the Imperium's war effort. Plans to retake the world were calculated accordingly under the direction of the Sons of Medusa chapter's Iron Thane, Valand Cal, the theater commander. The Sons of Medusa launched an orbital bombardment of predetermined landing zones on the outskirts of the Old City. They then occupied 3 company-strength landing zones on the edge of Galen VI's Old City, encircling it and destroying all resistance. As they say, like father, like son, and the Sons of Medusa certainly live up to their Primarch's reputation. Over the course of 3 days and nights, the industrious Sons of Medusa landed supplies and additional Astartes and began the task of fabricating new fortifications and bastions. On the dawning of the 4th day, an unnatural fear and dread descended upon the surviving 1,000,000 inhabitants. This fear was a calculated weapon employed by the Sons of Medusa, though I have a feeling they did not get this from the Iron Hands. This sounds like something another, darker Astartes Legion employed. Without warning, the chapter launched a large armored assault composed of rhinos, razorbacks, land raiders, and hulking dreadnoughts, while land speeders took to the skies. Alongside the green livery of the emerald-armored specters of death was the crimson colors of the Inquisition's chimeras and repressors. From their vehicles' hailers, the Inquisition demanded the immediate surrender of all of Galen VI's population for immediate judgment. Some of the population hurled themselves at the embodiment of the Emperor's wrath, only to be ruthlessly cut down by the Sons of Medusa, while others cowered in their hastily prepared defense positions or attempted to flee the city. Those that attempted to do so were also cut down by the patrolling land speeders and vulture gunships. Those that offered serious resistance within the city were isolated and destroyed. Only those that offered no resistance were spared, ignored by the Sons of Medusa as they had been so ordered. These survivors wept openly in joy, only to be taken by the Inquisition's troops for processing, to await their fate in the Holy Order's Assis bastions, awaiting them in the Imperial landing zones. The old city was firmly in the hands of the Imperials within 56 hours of the beginning of the Sons of Medusa's attack. As news of the massacre had spread across Galen 6, a shroud of terror descended upon the planet. Soon, millions of native and refugees alike surrendered, even though to do so was a death sentence, rather than live in fear of what was to come. Soon the ruins of the old city were repurposed and rebuilt as an internment and processing center to handle Galen 6's population. Overall, the Galen campaign was considered a success. Although much of the population of the old city had been slain, the total death toll was considered light compared to that of a lengthy, planet-wide campaign of attrition. Amazingly, the Ordo Hereticus was merciful, indenturing the majority of the planet's population into a lifetime of penal servitude to pay for their crimes and transgressions. As a result, the Departamento Minotarum raised a number of fresh penal legions from the most hardened elements found on the world, while the rest of the population was set to toil on Galen 6 itself or deported elsewhere within the Maelstrom zone to aid the rebuilding effort. The Sons of Medusa departed Galen 6 shortly thereafter, leaving the planet as a veritable prison world whose population would pay for their crimes against the Imperium for generations. Considering the alternative would involve a considerable amount of promethium, I would have to agree that the Ordo Hereticus was gentle in this case. Of course, given what was about to arrive in the sector, many worlds would soon beg for such a treatment. Yes, my loyal listeners, we are about to enter into the dark waters with a red wake behind us. Arriving without warning in 910, an unidentified, fire-blackened strike cruiser identified itself with ancient, though still valid Imperial authorization protocols. It was the Levitus Vex, and its coming heralded the arrival of a force whose name was to become synonymous with bloodshed and the darkest acts of the Badab War. The unidentified Space Marine force had come to offer its aid to the Loyalist cause against the secessionists, claiming to have come in answer to a summons from Terra itself. They identified themselves as the Carcharodons Astra, using the ancient High Gothic form of their name, and formally requested the Loyalist acceptance and permission to enter the war zone and draw blood. Upon their arrival, the Carcharodons' force commander Tiberius presented the Inquisitor Legate in charge of prosecuting the Badab conflict with notices patent provided to the chapter, affirming the rights and titles issued to it by several High Lords of Terra and Inquisitors now long dead. Tiberius even submitted himself for psychic probing and gene sampling. The Inquisitor Legate vouched for the Carcharodons. Lord High Commander Cullen accepted the Carcharodons into his line of battle, although he was still wary of their loyalties and their deviations from the Codex during their long voyage beyond Imperial space. I suspect that the Carcharodons' appearance was not simply a whim of fate or chance. Something, or someone, had made sure they would arrive in the Badab sector, just like their namesake would appear in an area drawn to the scent of blood. Soon they would spill it in greater quantities than the sector had seen, and they had their prime target before anyone else knew it. The badly mauled, but still dangerous, Mantis warriors. By 910, the strength of the Mantis warriors had been greatly diminished, but Cullen recognized the folly of leaving them undefeated at his flank as the Loyalists turned their full force to the invasion of the Badab sector. The Magister Militum had already considered a change in his deployment in order to mount a renewed offensive against the Endymion cluster, but with the arrival of the Carcharodons, the Lord High Commander had been offered an unexpected asset to deploy, and so he let loose their savage ferocity against the Mantis warriors and the unsuspecting worlds of their domain. The fleet of the Carcharodons broke out of warp directly above the Sigard system on the galactic plane, perilously close to Sigard's swollen and violent sun, masking their presence with its solar flares. Split up into dozens of striking forces, the gray-clad Space Marines let the Sigard system have the first taste of their wrath and fury, as they proceeded to devastate the numerous belt colonies, ship clans, and asteroid citadels. What had taken millennia to build and had withstood the ravages of xenos and corsairs alike were destroyed in mere days and weeks at the hand of these dreaded Space Marines. In the aftermath of this brutal campaign, an Imperial Navy scout vessel reported the entire system littered with wreckage, their Vox channels full of discordant ghost signals of dead and dying ships. It was also noted that the Carcharodons had deliberately plundered and scavenged, both in terms of gear, resources, and indeed human life. It has been the conclusion of several authorities since that the choice of Sigard, with its wealth of void colonies and infrastructure, had been the Carcharodons' first target, not simply because it had long connections with the Mantis Warriors, but because after the Carcharodons' unknown voyage from the outer darkness, they needed its bounty to replenish themselves for their part in the war. They were vicious and unrelenting Astartes, but they also knew what they would need. And the people of Sigard were the perfect supply depot for them. The Carcharodons continued to systematically annihilate planets in the cluster known to have harbored the Mantis Warriors, forcing this secessionist chapter to stop using their hit-and-run tactics against the Loyalists and mass their forces in defense of these worlds. This strategy was likely what Force Commander Tiberius wanted, as it spared his Carcharodons from having to pursue them across the cluster to places where their foes held the advantage of support and local knowledge. First, the Carcharodons ravaged the feudal world of Iblis, smashing its infrastructure and putting its rulers to the sword. Then they attacked the planet's scattered settlements and nomadic crawler caravans by night, leaving bloody wreckage in their wake. They proceeded to turn Iblis into a wasteland inhabited only by shell-shocked survivors. The savage chapter then moved on and attacked the blighted industrial world of Endymion Prime itself, where a small Fire Angels force already held command of a decrepit manufactorum complex against Mantis Warrior-led insurgents. The Carcharodons launched an orbital assault oblivious to the Fire Angels' disposition on the planet, hundreds of gray-colored drop pods dropping to the planet's soaked cake surface. Honor-bound to defend this world, the Mantis Warriors were forced to respond, coming to Endymion's aid with increasing numbers of their chapter to curb the savagery of the Carcharodons' assault. Once again, the Carcharodons had planned for this, and now their prey came to them. Though the Mantis Warriors matched the Carcharodons with their own fierce martial skills, they were too few and could not turn the tide of the assault. Led by their chief librarian, Araza Redith, the Mantis Warriors refused to retreat and died in the defense of the planet. The Carcharodons continued to employ this pattern on the worlds of Sithal and Largitor, and then the twin worlds of the Tranquility System themselves. Each battle forced the Mantis Warriors to come to the aid of the beleaguered worlds, destroying their ability to affect the war. Now worn down and scattered, the chapter had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, but at a great price. In the aftermath of the Tranquility campaign, the Fire Angels, having suffered heavy casualties, sought permission to withdraw from the conflict. This was in no small part to the increasing anger of the Fire Angels against the Carcharodons, with whom they had repeatedly been at odds during the Tranquility campaign, and whose methods they held in utter contempt. Appalled by the actions of their allies, the Fire Angels withdrew the remaining contingents from the war with honor and returned to their homeworld to rebuild their sorely damaged forces. With the threat of the Endymion cluster neutralized, the Carcharodons redeployed, splitting their fleets to patrol the Loyalist rear echelons and relieve the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions to consolidate ahead of the expected invasion of the Badab sector. Unfortunately for the ravaged people of the Endymion cluster, this would not be the only time when calamity was visited upon their doomed worlds, for the Carcharodons would yet return in latter years to enact a final act of savagery against them. I would continue, my dear listeners, but if you listen, sounds like the Arbites have found me once again, so I will have to leave you. When we return, after I find another safe place to transmit, I will regale you with the lost tale of the Badab War and the growing schism that appeared within the secessionist ranks. But to do so, I need to get away. And the only way I can see that I can do that is through this pipe, which so happens to be a sewage pipe. Lucky for you, my listeners, the Vox transmission does not transmit smell. So hopefully I can send the next part of this tale to you. This is Imperial Loyalist Wolf. Hope you have a better day than I'm about to have.